hits straight up 7 o'clock, which it is, we will go ahead and start the program. I'd like to welcome everybody to the final installation of our winter workshop presentations gone virtual. We had a total of three programs. Had Anthony Bly talk about soil and carbon credits. We had Caitlin Briggs talk about the Farm ES program and how it helps manage and model for the future. And we're excited this evening to have Kristine Tidgren. She is an adjunct assistant professor in agriculture education and the studies department and director for the Center for Agricultural Law and Taxation, to talk to us this evening about carbon credit contracts, considerations, and questions to ask. Kristine, I usually say the podium is yours. I don't know how appropriate that is now, but the program is yours.
Awesome. The desktop is mine, right?
Yep.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you all for taking the time to be part of this program tonight. So here is my contact information. If afterwards you have questions, I always welcome people to email me or look me up online, and we can help answer questions that way as well. So tonight, my goal is to consider different options for what are some of the legal concerns and questions that we need to ask if we are interested in some of these carbon credit, carbon offset programs. Then if we have time at the end, I am going to also just talk a little bit about a few of the other carbon opportunities that might be out there for some of our farmers. And always, I welcome questions throughout or at the end. If there are questions, we can take those then. So many of you may have been part of an earlier program that talked a little bit about the carbon markets and what they are, but in case not, I just want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about before we start talking about these contracts themselves. And so really where this all flows is the idea that there's been a really huge increase in interest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in reducing carbon output, the need for carbon sequestration. So there's been a lot of initiatives, both at the federal level, but also a lot of new voluntary initiatives. And that's really what we're going to talk about tonight, are these voluntary carbon programs that have been emerging in different capacities. So I'm going to tell you about the different types of programs that are out there, and then just kind of talk through some of the questions that you would need to ask if you or your client or somebody that you're working with is thinking about signing up for one of these programs. So at the bottom line, when we're talking about a carbon credit, generally 1 ton of carbon dioxide that's sequestered in the soil is going to equal 1 carbon credit. Sounds pretty straightforward, sounds pretty quantifiable. The interesting thing is that it's really kind of difficult in the agricultural space to quantify it that specifically. And so that's one of the issues that we'll talk about tonight, is just about how verifiable these credits are, how we would be compensated if we would sign up for one of these programs, and what maybe some of the things are that we potentially are giving up by signing up for one program. Maybe we'll miss an opportunity for another one. So what we're talking about mostly in the agricultural space is going to be voluntary programs. So there are compulsory carbon markets out there where certain governments are mandating that corporations reduce their carbon footprint. Here in America, we don't have any federal such mandatory program. California has one such compulsory carbon credit market program where you have to reduce your carbon footprint. All companies are looking to be carbon neutral, so to speak, also just for their marketing and their publicity, to be able to tell consumers who are becoming very concerned about this that we are making a difference in the environment. We are reducing our carbon footprint. So there's a lot of different players out there looking to get into this area. One is just private market operators. And I call them that. Some people can call them aggregators. They do lots of different things, but companies like Nori, Indigo Ag, they have gone around to talk to farmers to try to get farmers signed up for their programs, where they are kind of creating a market where the farmer creates the credit or the offset by changing agricultural practices. So bottom line, the way that farmers, and we're talking grain farmers, crop farmers, actually on the livestock side, there's probably a lot more opportunity to make some difference. But most of the credits we're going to talk about tonight really are dealing with land practices. So maybe planting cover crops, switching to no-till, doing certain crop rotations. There's a whole list of different practices that if you engage in those, then the idea is they should reduce the amount of carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere. They should sequester carbon in the soil. And I say should because all things working as they should, that's what you would hope for. But soil science tells us that it's not always predictable how much carbon will be sequestered in the soil if you implement a particular practice. And that's where some of the difficulty comes with respect to carbon credits in the agricultural sector. So we're going to talk about some of that, but private market operators like Nori and Indigo are some of the companies that are going around signing up farmers. Also just corporate America in general, some of the agribusiness companies, they have created programs where essentially they will pay farmers or allow farmers to create offsets by also signing them up for changing different farming practices. And then what they get out of it is they will have the farmer then either generate a credit that then they will offset their own carbon footprint. So the company can say, you know, we are becoming carbon neutral because for the carbon that we are emitting through our practices and our processes over here, we're paying farmers to reduce their carbon footprint. So we're offsetting the carbon emissions. This is the way this whole, I guess, area works. The idea is offsetting carbon emissions with carbon sequestration. Also, there's some environmental partnerships that are groups that consortiums and things that are also starting to try to get into this space. One of the ones that's a player here is the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. They allow farmers to sign up for their program, create carbon offsets. Other people buy them. Carbon registries, that's a different kind of player in the market. They're the ones that actually will assign numbers to the credits. It's sort of more of a technical space. So the groups that are helping farmers generate the credits and signing the farmers up many times are partnering with the carbon registry to actually have a full-fledged program. So one of the players in that area is for example the Climate Action Reserve. And then there's a whole category of professionals that are verifiers. These are the people that have to actually make sure that what the farmer said they were going to do, they changed the practice that they were doing, and they need to verify that the carbon actually was sequestered in the soil. So this actually involves soil testing before, soil testing after, and then trying to quantify based on those soil tests, was their actual carbon sequestered and to what extent that created a credit. Can you quantify that and what do we have that we can sell. And then there's people out there who are buying these credits. So who are the buyers? Well, some of the buyers are corporate America. They are going off again in a voluntary market to purchase credits so that they can say in their prospectus, they can say in their marketing literature, they can tell their customers, we are offsetting our carbon footprint by buying credits over here. So again, they're telling the world, we care, we're doing the best we can for the climate. Then there's also just individual buyers. Maybe somebody over in California that wants to make a difference in the climate is going to go out to one of these markets and just buy some credits, maybe to offset a trip they're taking across the country. Lots of people have lots of different reasons as far as why they might be purchasing these credits. But in the agricultural space, I guess farmers are looking to new opportunities for supplemental income, ways that they can perhaps be compensated for making a difference. And so that's sort of how we come into this. Now, we do have a new law that was passed right at the end of 2022, and Congress has looked at this for a long time. This had passed the Senate in 2021. It's called the Growing Climate Solutions Act, and it's just nothing too significant in terms of it's not earth-shattering what it will do. But what it is directing is for the USDA to certify a program for third-party verifiers. So when we talk about this a little bit more, you'll kind of understand where this comes in. But we have carbon credits that are being generated, but to verify that they actually exist, you're having verifiers, scientists that come in and test the soil. Well, that right now, there's nothing that gives us consistency or standards, et cetera. So what this act does is it allows the USDA to create a certification program so that technical assistance can be provided to farmers and ranchers who are thinking about, do I want to get into this carbon offset market? Do I want to look at it? Who can I trust? So there would be some verification happening within USDA for these different players that we talked about. Also, the USDA would be responsible to connect the landowners to anybody in the private sector who could assist them in implementing some of these practices. So essentially, we're talking about monetizing positive change to improve the climate. So that's what we're looking at. And that new law just went into effect at the end of the year. So we'll see what happens. We'll be hearing some things from the USDA soon. Also, I'm sure that you heard that in August, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and that has a whole bunch of money and credits directed toward climate smart programs. In the farming sector, some of the programs that we will see over the next, several years will be increases in funding for EQIP and CSP. And this is not just to continue the current programs that we already have with cost share, et cetera. This is to create new programs that are focused on carbon sequestration, not just soil and water conservation. So whole new look, whole new set of programs. We'll be seeing those roll out because a whole bunch of money has gone into that. Also, we're really watching the 2023 Farm Bill because that is going to also have, I have no doubt, some opportunities for funding that farmers can look to if they implement some climate smart practices. So again, there's a lot happening in this area. There's a lot of moving parts. And so we just need to sort of become educated about what some of those options are. So there's a lot of different approaches. I can't tell you, here's what a carbon offset program looks like. Here are the legal questions you need to ask, because first of all, they're all very, very different. So I have two examples here. I got these from the Congressional Research Service. They had some nice graphics. And this is the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium approach. That's one of those groups. It's kind of a partnership with different companies that has gotten together to sort of create a program that they're hoping to encourage farmers to be part of. And in this one, the way theirs works is they go out, they reach out to producers, the producers enroll in the program, they change their farming practices, there's soil sampling on site, there's a quantification of how many credits are possible. Then the credits are verified, and then the credits are generated, and then they're sold to these third parties, the housewife in San Francisco, or the corporation in Oregon, or wherever they are, and then eventually the farmer gets paid. That's one approach to how this works. Another one is Corteva. They're a project developer who's come up with one of these programs as well. They work to encourage farmers to sign up with their carbon market program. They also require third-party verifiers, profits associated are paid to the farmer, but the farmer often has to pay for different costs and expenses. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is just make sure, if you're interested in one of these programs from a legal perspective, you really have to understand what it is you're signing up for. So this is kind of right now still an emerging, uncertain space. It is not one of those safe things that, yeah, we've all been through this, we know what to watch for, we know what to look for, because everybody's still trying to make their place in this market. So different groups have great ideas, they want to enroll people, they're sort of fighting for the same customers, so to speak. And so as farmers, as producers, we need to watch and make sure that we are thinking about all of the opportunities and thinking about potentially missing opportunities because we've signed up for a program now. Couple things about all of these programs is that what we are selling when we're selling carbon offsets or carbon credits is we're not creating a new property right. That's not the way it's working, even though we're doing something on our land generally that's going to change the way that either the carbon is sequestered or whether the carbon gets emitted or not. So really it's all contract based. So because it's just selling basically a contract right, there's no real property rights involved. This is not an easement, it's not a license, it's just, hey, I promised to do this, you promised to pay me this if you're able to sell what I've generated, etc. So we have to look at this just like we would look at any other contract evaluation. And that involves just really understanding what it is that the contract says. And I have to tell you, every one of these contracts is going to be different. So there's no set template to say, here's what this does, here's what this does, here's what this does. So in this program, my goal is really to kind of give you the questions to ask and to also encourage you, before you really sign up for anything significant, it's probably not a bad idea to seek legal counsel to make sure that you understand all the obligations that you're signing up for, because some of these contracts are going to prevent you from taking advantage of other programs down the road. Some of them may be requiring you to do things for a longer period of time than you realize. All kinds of things that could be. Also, these programs and contracts are going to be written by the companies. There's really not going to be any opportunity necessarily for negotiation. There's sort of what we call contracts of adhesion, where it's like, here's the contract, sign it, and you either accept our terms or you don't. And so that's something that's different than some of the contracts we're able to negotiate. These types of contracts aren't really intended to be negotiable because they've got the program the way they want it. You either accept the terms that they propose or you don't participate. Now, anytime that we're talking about a real carbon credit or a real offset or something that would actually have a market value, you would have to really make sure that the program is selling something that's real. And so in the world of carbon credits, there are some terms that we don't use anywhere else that I want to introduce you to. And one of those terms that is really key in the carbon credit world is additionality. What additionality says is it's not a valid credit unless you're actually implementing a new practice, a practice that you weren't doing before. So if I was an early adopter and I've always planted cover crops for the last 5 or 6 years, and now I want to sign up for this program, and one of the things I could do to generate a carbon credit is to plant a cover crop. Most of these programs are going to say, sorry, you can't because you've already done that. You're already doing that. We need to have you do something you wouldn't do otherwise, or you weren't doing before, because otherwise you're not generating anything new. You're not offsetting carbon that wouldn't be offset otherwise. Now, not all of these programs require this, but most of them do if they're actually trying to create a credit that has some resale value. And so we have to be careful, because once we've enrolled in one program, we're most likely going to be barred and ineligible from enrolling in another program. Now, in some cases, there might be portability where you can go from this program to this program, but in other cases, you won't be. We also have to be very careful that this is not going to bar us from participating in some farm program benefits from the federal government. So if the Farm Bill comes out with a new program that we want to participate in, or one of the new EQIP programs that looks like it would be really good for us to participate in, we need to make sure that we're not preventing ourselves from doing that, or that at least we understand when we sign up for one of these programs, we understand what it is that we're giving up. Another term that we don't really use outside of this carbon credit market is stacking. And what stacking says in the carbon credit world is that you cannot accept payment from multiple programs for the same practice. Now, that might seem a lot like additionality, but additionality says you're not generating a credit if you've already been practicing this. And stacking just says you can't double dip, right? So I can't get multiple benefits from implementing a new crop rotation pattern, for example. Now, one of the interesting things about stacking and the stacking prohibitions or the additionality prohibitions is that you have no real way that people are going to know. So it's a little bit on your honor system, because there's no nationwide registry right now of, well, this is the practice that's happening on this farm over here. So people who are interested in buying real credits, that's a knock against purchasing these types of credits, because there's really no guarantee that the stacking isn't happening. It's difficult to even know for sure that these are actually reflecting additionality. So, this is why the quality of a carbon credits in the soil area is sometimes questioned, and it may take a little bit of evolution and development before we get something that actually has a good market value. A couple of other terms that define quality carbon credits or offsets are permanence and leakage. And so again, these are concepts that we'll see reflected in these contracts. They won't probably use permanence or the word leakage or the word additionality or the word stacking. They'll just have little clauses that will say things like you can't participate in two programs, or if you're enrolled in this program, you cannot sign up for a government program where you get benefits for implementing these practices. Permanence says, to have a real carbon credit, you actually have to show that you're going to store that carbon for more than just a year or two. That's kind of difficult in this sector. real carbon credits would say that's 100 years or more would be standard. Um, to get these components in place will be really critical, I think, before the agricultural sector is looked at as being able to produce really high quality credits. Also, leakage says, okay, you're implementing this practice over here that sequesters carbon. We need to also make sure that you're not over here compensating for what you're changing over here by doing something on this part of your farm that's going to cause more carbon to be emitted. So there's those checks as well that some of these programs might be watching for, which is, if you're thinking through this, it means a lot of oversight possibly in some of your farming practices, and how comfortable are you with that? Also, we have to understand, if we sign up for the program, what specific practices are we required to implement? What are we agreeing to? And then how will this impact my regular agricultural production? Will I be restricted, like I said before, from enrolling my land in CRP if I want, or from selling a conservation easement down the road, or from signing up for a new EQIP program or CSP? These are all questions that we have to ask and read the language and understand what our contract says. Now, these different programs, they vary so much. So some are just a one-year contract where you just implement a practice and they'll pay you money to implement the practice. That's the most basic, most simple. Most of them are not like that. Most of them are, you sign up maybe for 5 years, maybe for 10 years. You promise to implement these practices. You will have to show that the practice that you implemented actually caused carbon to be sequestered. Then that means that you have generated a carbon offset or a certain number of carbon offsets. Then those carbon offsets will be made available for third parties to purchase, and then they purchase those, and then from that purchase price, the fee of the group that you've been working with is deducted, as well as perhaps the fee of the cost of the verification, etc. And you see, in the end, whatever's left over will go back to the producer. That's how a lot of those work. Now, long contracts, those are something to be really cautious about if they prevent you from being able to participate in other options down the road, because signing yourself up for a long contract this early on in this market, that's sort of evolving, changing, not very clearly defined, might be something to be very careful about. Now, the other thing that you really need to know is, how will I get paid? Sounds pretty straightforward, like, well, of course, I'm sure they'll write me a check. It's actually not all that way. Some of the payments call for tokens or cryptocurrency. Some of them, like I said, you're going to have to pay a lot of expenses that are associated with this. Others don't. Some require the farmer to pay for the verifier. Others don't. Some have a pretty large broker fee, others don't. One of the knocks on this right now is that none of these programs are really paying extraordinarily high prices. So it's a little bit of supplemental money, maybe $15 an acre if you're lucky and all the things check out, something like that. But in many cases, much less. So we just have to kind of watch and see how that develops too. You have to understand what you're being paid for. Are you guaranteed payment if you implement a practice? Or are you possibly not going to receive anything even after signing away your rights to participate in other programs, because whatever program or whatever practice you implemented, when they do the testing, they say, you know, it was kind of dry, or it was a certain condition in the atmosphere, and because of that, we just didn't really sequester very much carbon, so you did not generate the credits that you thought you would. That's possible under some of the programs where you can actually do everything you said you would do, and you're still not going to get paid the price that you thought you would. Also, we have to watch for this verification. And this is where the Growing Climate Solutions Act might be helpful, because it's hopefully going to sort of put some standards in place for who these verifiers can be, what kind of technical experience do they need to have. There'll be a registry of those. It's important to understand what they're checking for, what verification requirements are going to be imposed in order for me to get paid. How much carbon do I have to sequester? What's the overall carbon footprint of my operation? Are they going to check all of that? Are they going to require me to tell them everything about all of my farming practices, or are they just going to maybe do a little test on a certain part of my land? You're going to need to check that out and understand exactly what's going to be involved. Now, a lot of these programs are going directly to the tenants. So they're coming to the tenants, the farm tenants who are actually engaged in the farming on the land, the ones who actually have the control to be able to change farming practices, and they're trying to sign them up. But one of the keys to watch out for is that you cannot sign up for one of these programs without the landlord giving permission. So in many cases, it's a two-step process. And so if you're a landlord, you need to think through whether you really want your land tied up in one of these programs. Technically, it's not your contract. You're not the person who's agreeing to do this. You're not the person either getting paid for it. But does the fact that your land has been associated with one of these programs, does it foreclose any opportunities for you as a landlord later on, as a landowner, for example, from signing the land up in CRP or anything like that? You just have to kind of understand what you're signing when you allow your tenant to enroll in one of these programs. Are you signing away rights for your land later on? So also the tenant who's signing up needs to make sure that they have a lease that's at least as long as the carbon contract, because you're promising to do things on land, and if you don't have a legal right to be on that land, you're not going to be able to meet the terms of the contract. You'll breach the contract. You'll be responsible for damages. So these are just things we need to think about both as landlords and tenants. I think another important thing to think about is there's a lot of potential for data being collected from your operation, from your land, that perhaps you don't want floating out there in the public sphere. And so who owns the data that's being collected? What does the contract say about that? Who has the opportunity to see that data? What kind of privacy protections are there? I think it's really important to look at that before you sign up for one of these programs, just because you wouldn't want that data getting into the hands of someone that had their goal to be to harm agricultural operations. Then we really always, anytime we sign a contract, and it's no different for these contracts, is we have to understand what are the remedies, right? So if I'm going to sign up for a contract, the idea is if someone breaches on the other side, what are my rights? What are the things that this company that has written the contract, right? I'm not the one who wrote it. I just have to sign it. So they're going to, put in all the terms that are best for them, as any good attorney drafting their contract would do. And so we need to understand, what does that mean for me? And is there space now for me to be entering into a contract that's good for me as well as for the company I'm signing up with? So what are the penalties if I don't implement the program I promised to? What if it's impossible? Because let's say that I harvest and then the weather doesn't cooperate and I'm not able to plant those cover crops. Do I have to pay damages? Do I have to pay things back? Do I have penalties? What are the provisions that protect me if indeed I'm faced with something that I'm not able to do, if I'm not intentionally breaching, that type of thing? Also, what if they come and they verify and I've done everything I've said I'm going to do, but we still don't have sufficient carbon sequestered to have generated any amounts of credits that are sufficient? And so what happens then? Do I still get paid? Do I have to pay money back? It's just very important to read those terms. Are there penalties if they discover or determine that somehow this wasn't a new practice. And I'm not talking about fraud. I'm talking about maybe I didn't realize that something I did before wasn't allowed because it violated the additionality clause or requirement or the stacking prohibition. What if something is messed up there? Does that subject me to damages, to forfeiture of any payment that I would be entitled to? Just really important things to watch out for. And then what happens if they don't do what they say they're going to do? What if I don't get paid? What if the company goes out of business? Do I have the right to terminate or modify the contract if we realize if I sign up for a 10-year contract and we realize 5 years from now that really it's not cover crops that does a great job, it's something else? What are the opportunities that we have to sort of to transform the contract or evolve it as things get better? Are they requiring me, if we have any disputes, to go to arbitration or mediation, or can I sue in a court of law? What are my legal remedies if somebody doesn't do what they say they're going to do? And then are there choice of law or venue requirements? That's a big deal in the legal world when you're dealing with companies. They oftentimes will put a provision in there that makes you sue them way over in their space, maybe in California or someplace away from where you are. And then are there attorney fee shifting provisions so that if I sue them and I lose, they get attorney's fees from me, or vice versa? So, important things to think about. Also, we talked a little bit about data privacy, but also we need to understand land privacy. So what are we allowing the company to do in terms of come onto my property for measurement, for testing, for verification? Am I giving them rights to do that when I don't know they're coming? Is it a common, often thing, or is it a once a year thing? What exactly am I allowing them to do? And then just what we talked about before in terms of, am I giving them the right to make public or sell the data they collect? I think that's really important as well. Maybe they're taking the data and stripping it of any of the personally identifiable information and aggregating it and selling it that way. But is that something that you want to happen? Those are things to consider, things to look for in the contracts. Then just because it's close to my heart, because I deal in the tax world as well, just thinking about getting paid under one of those contracts, what would be the tax implications? Well, right now we're not talking about huge dollars, but what we think for most of these programs, it's just likely going to be regular farm income, which means it would be subject to ordinary income tax, self-employment tax. So you're not really going to get a break on taxes with that. So when it comes to these contracts, and I say final thoughts, I've got some other things I'm going to talk about as well, but some final thoughts to think about before you would sign a contract for one of these carbon programs is really to seek trusted technical and legal advisors before you would sign it. Make sure you read the contract carefully. And then my biggest thing, as I've said, is just consider the risks and the lost opportunity costs that you might have just from signing up for a program, and then something better comes along and it's like, nope, you can't do it because you've already locked into this one. So think about those things. Another thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm here for questions anytime you'll want to pop in, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time tonight too when we're talking about carbon credits. Another really big deal in the agricultural space right now for farmland owners across the Midwest is really the carbon sequestration and the programs and the opportunities that are coming to farmers in that regard. And so I've been getting a lot of questions about that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that since it's very closely related to the carbon credits, because it's also about carbon sequestration. The idea with the carbon pipelines is that these companies, and in particular right here in the Midwest, we have 3 companies that have some proposals that I'll show you a map in a minute. But what they're seeking to do taking advantage of federal tax credits for carbon sequestration, but also in the case, for example, of Summit Carbon Solutions, they're seeking to help the ethanol industry reduce its carbon footprint to make it truly more renewable, with the idea that it would help continue the ethanol industry in a climate friendly way. And so the proposal by Summit is that they want to build what's called a hazardous liquid pipeline that would take the carbon that's emitted, the carbon dioxide that's emitted from the ethanol plants. It would convert it to liquid form. It would pipe it through these underground pipelines, and it would eventually put it, in the case of Summit, into an underground vault up in North Dakota, sequester it forever in the ground. That's the idea behind these programs. And so this one in particular, Summit, would go through North Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Iowa. So the kind of the region that's here in the Moo University, which is why I thought I'd talk about it for just a minute. And they want to complete it in 2024. I kind of doubt if it will get completed, but like I said, that quickly, because there's a lot of hurdles to kind of jump through. But the idea is to capture the CO2 before it goes out into the atmosphere, transport it through the pipeline, store it underground in North Dakota. And here's the map of where they would like to lay this pipeline. And what's been happening out there in the countryside is the land managers from the pipeline companies have been out negotiating with farmers and rural landowners to say, hey, please sell us an easement. We want to put a pipeline under your farm. And you can see that picture there too with the little dots, different plants throughout the Midwest that would be part of this carbon pipeline program. And so far they've had 3,800 easement agreements signed with 2,300 different landowners. And the idea is they have to get approval from the governing bodies from the different states. In Iowa, that approval body is the Iowa Utilities Board. So as an example of how this process works, in Iowa, they first had to do informational meetings, which they did. Then they filed for this hazardous liquid pipeline permit, which they filed their application. And then the next thing that will happen, but it hasn't happened, and this has been on file already for a year, is they will have to have a hearing before the Iowa Utilities Board. The Iowa Utilities Board has to determine whether this carbon pipeline meets what's called the public convenience and necessity. And if they determine that in Iowa, they will be cloaked with eminent domain authority, which means if you don't agree to sell the company an easement, they can take it through condemnation. So it's a very interesting, evolving area. We know that the hearing for Summit in the Iowa area will be held at the Webster County Fairgrounds, but we don't have a date yet because they haven't set that date. There are two other Midwest pipelines that are also pending. The second one is the Navigator Heartland Greenway. And this one is also seeking to build across Illinois and Iowa and other parts of the Midwest. I'll show you a map here in a minute. But this one is sequestering, or would seek to sequester, carbon from biofuel producers and other rural industrial processors like fertilizer plants. So here's the picture. Those of you in South Dakota would go through there, a little bit in Nebraska, a little tiny bit in Minnesota, and then Iowa and Illinois. The dots are capture facilities where it would actually right now be capturing carbon. And I think all of these pipelines, the goal would be they would grow them as they would develop further, but this is sort of the initial route that they've planned. And then the last one in this area is called Wolf Carbon Solutions, which is a partnership with the Archer Daniels Midland Company. So this is another example of a big company that says, hey, we want to reduce our carbon footprint. So what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of these federal tax credits. We're going to implement carbon sequestration. So they too are looking at building a carbon pipeline. And so the next few minutes, just because it relates so much to what we talk about with carbon credit contracts, is I want to tell you about these pipeline easement contracts or these pipeline easement agreements, because so many of our people out there have been approached or will be approached by these companies that are wanting to purchase these easements. So just a couple of things, and then I'll wrap it up and open things up for questions. But typically, when one of these companies comes and wants to purchase an easement, there's going to be several things they're going to purchase. They're going to want to purchase a permanent easement for where the pipeline would actually be laid. Then they're going to want to purchase a temporary easement for all the periods of time when they would need to do construction, because during the construction time, they're going to need to take over a larger portion of your land than the portion that simply has the pipeline. And then things like crop damages. They'll be destroying the crop that's on the ground if it's happening at certain times of the year. They'll be likely destroying some tile they'll need to repair. So all of these things landowners need to watch for to make sure that they're being compensated. They also need to understand whether the company is agreeing to repair everything that they're supposed to be, making sure that the liability and indemnity provisions are sound so that you're not going to be liable if somebody gets hurt during the process of the pipeline being purchased, etc. Another thing to watch for is what rights does the company have with respect to this easement. So I'm selling you an easement for a carbon sequestration pipeline. What happens if the governing authority does not give you permission to buy it, to build it? Can you do something else there? Or does the contract specifically say it's only for a carbon sequestration pipeline? These are things that you need to make sure to watch for. And then one of the big questions and the big points of misunderstanding that I want to make sure people understand when they sell one of these is there will be tax consequences. And so if I sell an easement that's permanent, it's going to be very much like I sold a piece of land with a couple of differences. And really, you have these slides that Fred is providing to you, so I'm not going to go into all of them. I just want to give a quick example to kind of show you how this would work. You would first look and say, okay, the company paid $10,000 for an easement along the southern boundary of Samantha's farm for the construction and maintenance of a pipeline. The easement crossed about 20 acres of Samantha's 600-acre farm. The basis or the cost or where she inherited the land or whatever, her basis is $300 an acre. Now, the way the law works, some people might say, well, I will get to reduce the basis of my 600-acre farm by the $10,000 payment. But the law says, no, you can only reduce the basis for the immediately affected land. So that means the 20 acres that the pipeline crosses. So if you take 20 acres times the $300 per acre basis, you can use only $6,000 of basis to offset the $10,000 payment. What does that mean? Well, in this particular example, Samantha is going to have to pay taxes on $4,000 because she has a $4,000 gain. So, typically that's 15% tax. And so she would have to pay that on her income tax return. But sometimes no tax will be due, and that would be the case if her basis were higher. So let's say she just purchased the farm, so her basis is $14,000. In this case, the $10,000 payment would be less than the $14,000 basis. She could just reduce her basis and she wouldn't have any gain that she would have to report. So in that particular case, the basis of that portion of the land would now be $4,000 per acre, but she wouldn't have to pay any tax. The other thing that's different is if you are selling one of these term easements. So we talked about the perpetual easement, that is the portion where the pipeline goes. That one's permanent. That's going to be treated like the sale of land. But for a term easement, generally that's in this case for the construction of the pipeline. That one's treated differently. That one is just going to be ordinary income tax, like a rental payment. Now, you're not going to have to pay self-employment tax on it, but you'll have to pay ordinary income tax on that, just like you were getting rental payment. It's very similar to if you signed up for a solar farm, if you signed up for wind energy and you got yearly payments that were treated like rental payments. You would just report those and treat them as ordinary income. So you'd have to pay tax on them, but you wouldn't have to pay any self-employment tax. Now that's different from those crop damage payments. So let's say they decide to come in and start building the pipeline after you planted, you invested all of your inputs, you went through all that expense and everything. Then you're going to expect, if they destroy your crop, some crop damage payments. And so that'd be part of the negotiation. And so any crop damage payments you get, you're going to look at those and it's going to be, what is that? Well, it's replacement income. So the tax law says, well, I have to report that the same as I would have reported income I got from the sale of my grain. So in that particular case, yeah, report it the same way as you would a crop sale, which means it's going to be ordinary income. It's going to be subject to self-employment tax. And so a little example of Morris, he raises corn and soybeans on rented farmland. The carbon company paid him $20,000 for the damage to the crop that occurred during the installation of the pipeline. And that's an example where sometimes the tenant will be the one who gets the crop damage payment. That's something to negotiate between the tenant and the landlord in case it goes through one of these spaces that's rented farm ground, which a lot of it does. Also, one more thing I want to bring to your attention, and then we'll open it up for any discussion that you want to have, and that is involuntary conversion. So sometimes in the tax world, if I have property that's stolen, if I have property that's condemned, so let's say that the carbon company is granted the authority to condemn an easement, because I say, no, I don't want to give you an easement, or they get the authority to condemn. And so I say, okay, I see the writing on the wall, you're going to condemn, so I will negotiate and sell it to you. If it came to that point where the carbon company got the authority to actually build the pipeline, that comes with the right for eminent domain. At that point in time, if you sell an easement to the company, you could likely take the proceeds that you get, the money that you're paid for that, and this 1033 section of our tax code would allow you to reinvest those proceeds in something else. Property that is similar or related in service or use to the property that was the subject of the easement. And you would actually, under this law, have 3 years to reinvest those proceeds. So it's something to think about. You can actually use this. It's very like, many of you may know or be familiar with Section 1031. That's a like-kind exchange. This is the sister provision. It just happens for things that are involuntary. And so it's good enough if you have a threat of condemnation. You don't have to have an actual condemnation, just if you have a threat. So in this particular case, I say, if these companies actually get permission from the state agencies to build the pipeline, I think it would be at that point in time that landowners could take advantage of 1033. They could get paid for the easement. They could reinvest those proceeds tax-free without paying tax over by purchasing some other type of property. And so just wanted to give you a little bit of heads up on some of the other things going on with carbon, because really one of the biggest projects that we're seeing here in the Midwest is this idea of these carbon pipelines. So we have to kind of see where they go. None of them have gotten their approval yet, but I think they will be a big deal down the road. So that was the material I wanted to talk to you about, and I just wanted to open it up to see if anybody had any thoughts, questions, comments, or anything like that.
Thank you, Kristine. Since we're a small group here, I'd invite you to just go ahead and unmute and ask the questions directly. Or if you feel more comfortable, go to the chat box and put it in there and we'll try to catch it.
And if you think of something later or you're watching the video, feel free to email me. I like to hear from you, so you can always ask questions directly that way too.
Okay, while everybody's kind of thinking about their question, can you give us just a quick overview of options available for cattle producers, especially as it relates to digesters? They seem to be popping up. Front page of our local paper had a new one coming to fruition with 3 producers in the area.
Yeah, so Fred, the digesters and things, that's really not my specialty. I
Okay.
think one of our livestock specialists would probably be a better person to talk about the science behind that or whatever. As far as credit or offset opportunities associated with those, there are some available, and I would just suggest that you could research and see on the online to see. There aren't as many of those so far popping up, even though once they do, I think that they will be more quantifiable. So I think they'd actually be a good opportunity possibly for some supplemental income opportunities.
So the pipelines that will be transversing the county, are they pretty similar as far as contracts that, if they're going through my property to get to the digester or from the farm?
So yeah, the interesting thing about those contracts is that they're going to start off with sort of some boilerplate contract language. But because they really, really, really want people to sign up because it helps their cause before the agency to say, we have 60% of the landowners that have now agreed. We have so many percent. They are willing to negotiate to some degree, and especially with price. So I just say if anybody's out there looking at one of these things, there's room for a negotiation, but that's a place where you really probably should hire some counsel to help, because they are open because they really want to be able to stand before the various boards and say, yeah, most all of the landowners are on board. There's only this 10% that won't agree. That helps their cause. So yeah, it's lots of provisions. The contracts are not as long as you would think. They're actually like simpler than you would think for something so complex. But again, you definitely need to understand what you're signing there as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. If someone's got a question, go ahead and unmute. Okay, I've got one more question. As you were talking about eminent domain and condemnation, it sounds like that's kind of the final steps. I'm sure there's a process that goes ahead of that. Can you kind of give us the Reader's Digest
Mhm.
view of that process?
Yeah, yeah. The interesting thing in Iowa, Fred, is that if the Iowa Utilities Board grants one of these companies a permit to build the hazardous liquid pipeline, it automatically gives the pipeline company the right to proceed with condemnation. So that gives them that authority. which is the big thing, right? And then once they have that authority, then they would follow the condemnation law, which is different in every state, but very similar. It involves having a commission of people who would value how much that property right was worth. And basically, it's just a matter of valuation, because what condemnation already says is, okay, we have the right to take it. We just have to pay you just compensation for it. And so there's a commission of kind of peers or people in the area that are assembled to do that valuation. But it's kind of difficult, because I will tell you, we saw this with a pipeline that went across some of our similar states a couple of years ago, the Dakota Access Pipeline. And those landowners that resisted, that ultimately had their land taken by eminent domain, unfortunately, the sad thing was they did not usually in the end get nearly as much money for their easement as the similar landowners who had sold voluntarily. So it was kind of a difficult situation, because they really held out wanting not to have to give up their land, and they lost out in monetary value as well. So these are tough matters. There's a lot of there's a lot of good people on all sides of these issues, and so it's kind of a difficult situation.
Kristine, this has been really great information. One question that goes through my mind is, are you aware of any limitations of producers signing up with multiple companies on some of these projects, or what type of limitations might exist if they're really looking to do the biggest bang for their buck and implement good practices?
Well, and that's why I mentioned in the contract section of the carbon credits is that you really have to watch the provisions, because most of them will say, no, you can't stack. You can't participate in multiple programs. That's what that stacking requirement is. The anti-stacking is that if you're signed up for our program, you're prevented from signing up for another program. So it is really important that you read the contract. Not all of them have that prohibition, but most of them will. And the reason they have it is because, as we said, kind of the law of carbon credits is you want to generate something that's real. And it's not very real if I'm double dipping, because essentially two people are paying for the same thing. So technically, they're only each getting half of the value that they're paying for. So that's why the prohibition is there. Like I said, it's kind of weird because there's no verification process out there. So it's kind of on the honor system, because how company A is going to know that you're also signed up with company C? There's no online database that kind of matches like we have in other worlds, but it's all part of that evolving space. I'm sure someday, if this continues, we'll have something like that to make sure that all of this is checked out. But good questions.
And Kristine, my question is, you mentioned about the landowners and the tenants and sorting through that, but my mind goes to like family farms and family transitions. Do the same concepts apply to somebody passing the land over to a family member, or how do those things get written up?
Well, it'd be like any contract that just because you die, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it would probably continue for the stated term, perhaps with the people who inherit your land. So just like if you sign up for a wind turbine to come on your land or something like that, same thing, you're leaving that for your heirs. That one's forever. The carbon contracts are a little different because they're contracts. So, the analysis would be, is it a personal contract? Again, that's another thing to think about. If it's just personal, it would die with you, but a lot of these contracts wouldn't necessarily die with you because they might be considered to be something that's sort of tied in with the land more than personal. But it could also be, in some of these cases, considered personal where it died with you. So it's a great question that is going to be fact specific and dependent on the individual terms of the contract.
Last opportunity to ask a question. Okay, I've got one last one. You'd mentioned a couple of pieces of legislation. Are there any other things floating that are in the works right now that can be impactful?
Well, I think for the carbon credit market, the Growing Climate Solutions Act was the one thing that was out there impacting agricultural producers. I think the biggest thing that we just need to watch for is, like I said, the 2023 Farm Bill. We don't know what all is going to be in there, but I would guess there will be some more provisions in that, dealing with climate smart practices, perhaps dealing with carbon sequestration, lots of opportunities, perhaps lots of new income opportunities. So I'm kind of excited thinking about what might be in there. And I think that's a piece of legislation we all need to watch the negotiations and just see what happens.
Kristine, thank you very much for the presentation. A lot of great information out there. I'd like to remind the listeners that hopefully in the next day or so, you will get an email that'll have the URL or the link for where this program recording will be able to be seen, as well as a evaluation. And I would encourage you to go ahead and take that evaluation, help us build better programs for the future. If not, I'd like to thank you again, and I'll go ahead and terminate the program.
Thank you, everybody.